an 11-liter aluminum cylinder or a 12-liter steel cylinder. Even I, with my experience in diving, have trouble sometimes to find the right one. So how would you? So whatever gear you choose, you need to do that with one idea in mind. How can I take the smallest amount of weights with me? That matters because the less weights you have, the safer you are. In case an equipment failure, you have less weights pushing you down. You will be exerted less in and out of the water. Why does that matter? Because the less tired you are, the less gas you will consume, and the more pleasant it's going to be. And third, it's simply going to be easier to carry a BCD or it's simply going to be easier for you to carry a BCD or a weight belt with less kilos of lead on it. I didn't tell you the whole truth. Earlier I said that there's an 11-liter aluminum cylinder and a 12-liter steel cylinder. And I kind of hinted that those are the only two options that you have. In practice, those two types of cylinders are fairly common to find, but in reality there's many more types of scuba cylinders, and there's a lot of aspects that you need to consider. Let me show you what I mean. The same thinking process applies to renting, but here, for the sake of example, let's say that you want to buy a scuba cylinder. So you go online and, oh wait, there's like dozens of options that you can choose from. How do you get to choose the right one? Here's a list of even more options. While it does seem complicated, you really need to consider only three main questions. Where do you dive? What types of diving do you do? And what gear do you have? When you think of diving, you're probably thinking a place with clear, blue, warm waters, somewhere like the Philippines. But that's the good stuff, you know, like an old wine that you open on special occasions. For me, most of my diving happens here in Latvia. Sure, I go sometimes to Dahab in Egypt or to Sardinia in Italy, but for the most part, it's cold water diving for me. That means pretty much consistently wearing warmer gear. For me, that is a dry suit with a thick undersuit. For others, that might be also a thicker wetsuit, something like 7 to 10 millimeters. But in the winter months, usually without a dry suit, nobody dives. Warmer gear usually means you're more buoyant. More buoyancy means that you need more weights with you so that you can actually descend. Now let's compare a typical steel and aluminum cylinder buoyancy. But before that, I want you to meet my friend Archimedes. We go way back. Archimedes of Syracuse was a Greek mathematician after which the Archimedes Principle was named. When an object like a scuba tank is placed in water, it applies a certain amount of downward force. At the same time, the amount of water displaced also creates an upward force. There's a little more to it, but this is pretty much the basics. If we take these two values, downward force and upward force, that means you can achieve three states of buoyancy. Positive buoyancy, when the upward force is stronger than downwards. Negative buoyancy, when the downward force is stronger than upwards. And neutral buoyancy, when both values are the same. So why do I say that an aluminum cylinder is a worse option, at least for my case, when I go dry suit diving with a thick undersuit? That is because an aluminum cylinder has a bigger external volume, but the weight of an aluminum cylinder and a steel cylinder is pretty much the same. So given that, the amount of water displaced by the aluminum cylinder is bigger, and therefore the upward force is bigger. In diving with aluminum cylinders, some divers actually say that they feel floaty at the end of the dive. Why is that? Because air, or any gas for that matter, compressed in a cylinder actually has weight as well. So let's take an example of an 11-liter aluminum cylinder with air compressed to 200 bars. So the air inside actually is going to weigh about 2.7 kilograms while the cylinder is full. Breathing out this air, the weight inside the cylinder decreases. So with aluminum cylinders, usually you start the dives a little bit negatively buoyant, but as the dive goes on, you become more and more positively buoyant. At the same time, steel cylinders remain negatively buoyant throughout the dive, regardless of whether they're full or empty. I failed to consider this when I first went into side mounting, and I looked at all the side mount divers in warm water places like Mexico diving with aluminum cylinders. So I decided, you know what, seems like a good idea. Let me buy 2 aluminum cylinders. My cylinders arrive, I go into the water, and I need 13 kilograms of weight. And that's a lot of weight. The BCD that I carry doesn't even have enough slots for that, so I had to improvise and put a couple of them on my waist belt. Afterwards, I decided, you know what, something's wrong. I decided to record myself, send the recording to the divers that I was actually watching, and I asked them, hey, what's wrong with my setup? Why am I requiring 13 kilograms of weight? They came back immediately with an answer that, dude, you're in cold waters with a dry suit, with a thick undersuit, and you're using aluminum cylinders. Switch to steel and your problem is going to go away. So that's what I did. I switched to steel cylinders, and I went from needing 13 kilograms of extra weight to 4 kilograms of extra weight. So in summary, a steel cylinder stays negative throughout the dive, and that's why the buoyancy characteristics of a steel cylinder are more predictable. An aluminum cylinder is something that you would frequently see in, let's say, wetsuit diving, warm water diving. Let's say, for example, in Egypt, almost everyone dives with only aluminum cylinders, whether that's side mount, single tank back mount, etc. And here's another interesting fact. And because of the buoyancy characteristics of aluminum cylinders, if you go diving with decompression tanks or stage tanks, you always take them as aluminum cylinders, even if the other cylinders that you have are steel. There is a slight difference between a single tank back mount recreational dive and a multi-stage decompression dive with 4 to 5 cylinders. If you go with the former, any single cylinder that you choose that's common to your area is going to serve you just fine. For that, I suggest simply go to your scuba instructor or your friends that do scuba and ask them, hey, what type of cylinders do you use? And most likely the ones that they're using are going to be totally fine for you. For more diverse types of diving, the real question is, how much are you willing to invest? Let's say you do want to do a decompression dive. Here in Latvia, steel cylinders are a little bit more common than aluminum cylinders. So for you, it might make sense to actually invest in an aluminum cylinder and rent the steel cylinders. So in summary, whether you do a short reef dive or a 40-meter cave dive, the type of cylinder you choose matters. So we talked about where do you dive, what types of dives do you do, and now let's talk a little bit about what gear do you use. When choosing scuba cylinders, you really need to consider only 2 pieces of equipment: your regulators and your suit, wetsuit or dry suit. I already touched upon this a little bit earlier, but now let me give you a little bit more detail. Let's start with the regulators. Scuba cylinders are usually equipped with one of 2 valves: din or yoke. The regulator you choose has to be compatible with the valve. That's a separate topic we can dive into later, but in general, you're going to be totally fine if you choose a din valve and din regulators. In US, Japan, and some parts of Eastern Asia, you can fairly commonly find yoke cylinders, but if you have a yoke regulator, you can actually get a yoke adapter that you screw into the din valve. Then there's low pressure and high pressure cylinders. Low pressure cylinders are usually filled up to 232 bars or about 3,300 psi. It's much easier to find low pressure cylinders find the gear that's needed for them, and it's a bit faster to assemble. High pressure cylinders are usually filled up to around 300 bars, which is about 4,300 psi. These tanks have the following considerations. You get more gas, but you need special compressors that can actually fill these cylinders up to 300 bars, and it takes a longer time to actually fill them. You need regulators that can be screwed into a special high pressure cylinder valve. Right? That's not your typical low pressure regulator. The threads on a high pressure cylinder valve are actually longer than on a low pressure cylinder valve. High pressure tanks also become heavier when full because air, or whatever gas you use compressed, also has weight. With high pressure cylinders, you can only use DIN valves. There are no yoke high pressure cylinders. So what about the suit? So we have a dry suit and a wetsuit, right? There's also semi-dry suits, but let's not consider those for now. So when we take a wetsuit, the buoyancy characteristics of wetsuits are fairly predictable, right? They are essentially compressed air in a neoprene material. And the deeper you go, the more it compresses, so the less buoyant it becomes. But you can pretty much not worry about the buoyancy characteristics for most of your dives, especially for recreational diving. But if we take a dry suit, then a dry suit is a suit that has air in it. And the air is what actually keeps you warm, including, of course, the clothing that you wear. So with that in mind, because there's air inside the dry suit, it is essentially another source of lift. Because if you fill the dry suit, let's say, fully with air, you're going to be like a balloon that's trying to go up. So that's why usually with dry suits, the buoyancy characteristics are much more towards the positive side. Therefore, typically you need also more weights to actually be able to descend. And that's why the choice of a steel cylinder is usually the right one for any dry suit diver. True, if you go dry suit diving with almost no undersuit, so let's say you just go in your base layer, yes, you might be okay with an aluminum cylinder. So, in summary, the regulator that you choose matters because you need it to be compatible with the valve and also with whether it's a high pressure or a low pressure cylinder, right? You can't put low pressure regulators into a high pressure cylinder valve. And the suit also matters. A dry suit is an extra source of lift, while a wetsuit has a more predictable impact on your buoyancy. So after hearing this, you might remember scenes like people floating in saltwater and thinking, wait a minute, there's saltwater and there's freshwater. Is there a buoyancy difference? And yes, actually, I haven't talked about that in this video, but there's absolutely a buoyancy difference. In short, saltwater is more dense and therefore the upward force of the displaced water is higher. And that means also that you need more weight usually to actually go down. Typically about 1 to 2 kilos extra compared to what you need in fresh water. But that's a topic in and of itself. You can look it up, or I can make a video of it later. Let me know in the comments. I know that there's so much more to talk about in this topic. And it was really hard actually not to keep adding details. And let me know in the comments if you want me to create another video or going in depth about any of the other topics that I mentioned. So other than that, hope this was helpful to you and see you in the next one.